I always say that one has to understand it is not so much about architecture having the power of being social or non-social. If you understand architecture as a service industry, or as a service that you provide to someone that is, asking you to do something, then clearly that is attached with the idea that architecture changes its purpose according to the person that hires them, right? So at the moment, we have all this extreme capitalist, condition where we have a situation where the gap between rich and poor continues to increase, where we know that the service of an architect professional is perhaps of its top in terms of how expensive it is, right? The purpose today of architecture is without doubt not social, right? And that's, I think, where we stand at this point. So I don't see whether or not architecture has or not a social purpose. Architecture is just a thing, right? And that thing, according to where it's corresponding, where how it's being used, how it's being, changes its meaning. And I think this is one of the reasons I started to lose interest in architecture, right? Because of not only of its lack of positionality, this object being transitioned from all kinds of periods, right? Many historians like to talk about, well, architecture transcends history. And we can discuss a lot of Italians in the 1970s and currently some neo-Italians of that time that say that architecture and form transcends history, and that, sometimes it could be fascist architecture and sometimes it could be, democratic architecture, but the architecture itself is just architecture, right? Well, I don't like that kind of statement. And because that takes away any responsibility from a professional standpoint, and the responsibility for those that care about their living environment is completely different to their eyes than being an architect or not being an architect. The current conditions, the extreme sort of neoliberal conditions of our times, the enormous disparity and suffering of a lot of people around needs a very different kind of practice that has not existed, and that it's a responsibility of new generations and some older generations that are thinking about this to restructure, a different kind of direction on how we perceive and work on cities. Now, that is not to say that architecture would cease to exist. Still the capitalists need architects, and still the non-profits will need architects. But I'm saying this with the idea that architecture will never cease to be what it always has been: static objects that are at the mercy of whatever social processes are around it, right? Now, we believe that the new practice, or new urban practice, has to do more with, again, designing those processes. And we are at the verge of, I guess it will take many generations, of inscribing what this new kind of practice is needed if we really want to respond to these enormous disparities that are around. Now, I say this because a lot of the work of cohabitation strategies, if not all, has focused on what we have discussed since we started, on this issue of transdisciplinarity. Now, transdisciplinarity for us is not multidisciplinarity. Or is not interdisciplinarity. I want to stress this very well, okay? Transdisciplinarity for us is when a discipline disappears and blurs itself in many others. So if we are approached with an urban problematic, the last thing we would do is to say, oh, this needs a building, or this needs a social issue, this needs a, whatever, situation. But on the contrary, we like to look at what is actually causing that problematic, right? And understanding the forces that are affecting that problematic. And it might be that that problematic is better dealt with a sociological direction, or with a non-sociological direction, or with a hybrid of directions. And the building is the last thing that it needs. So our position is that when you work in the city, you cannot be deterministic, in your output. And one of the greatest faults of architecture schools and the way architects think and are educated precisely falls into that. The first moment you get into a studio, you know that the end result of that studio is going to be a piece of architecture or a space. And that eliminates any other possibility, of interacting with urbanization, with its people, and with everyone. And what we claim as a radical change that needs to happen in institutes that teach issues about urbanization, in this case architecture, is that the deterministic mindset has to disappear. If we really want a new form of disciplinarity, a new form of addressing the city, of course, we need the technical capacities of the architect, and therefore someone should get educated on those technical capacities. But if your aim is to transform the urban environment, if your aim is to make our environment more equitable, more just, if you are sick of all the disparities that we see around, if you're sick of walking here in the city and not being able to afford a single thing that you see around you, which is what happens to most of the people, then that is not the right discipline for you, right? Then we should strive for the very different kind of discipline that many of us are trying to construct or reconstruct with all the questions. And then hopefully your generation will actually have the courage and will be intense enough to actually mobilize a new kind of movement, that addresses that situation today. And that not only goes to architecture, that goes to all disciplines.